The committee room felt tense the moment the discussion shifted toward the rising cost of living, something every person in the country had felt in one way or another. Students from a local university had been invited to watch the hearing, and among them were Maya Turner and Evan Brooks, two journalism majors who believed that seeing real debates up close would help them understand how leaders think. They didn't expect anything dramatic that morning, but the atmosphere changed as soon as Senator J.D. Vance adjusted the microphone and began speaking. J.D. Vance carried himself with a confidence that came from having explained his ideas many times before. He started calmly, explaining why he supported changes to the SNAP program. He said the country needed to control spending, help people become independent, and make sure assistance went to those who truly needed it. He spoke about responsibility, about how support programs should encourage growth instead of long-term dependence. He kept his voice steady, almost gentle, as if he wanted to make sure even critics understood he wasn't attacking anyone personally. To him, this was about the system, not the people. Maya listened closely, taking notes the way her professor taught her. She didn't agree with everything he said, but she could follow his logic. He made it sound like tough choices were necessary, like cutting some benefits now would create stability later. She glanced at Evan, who looked uneasy. He had lived through a rough period when his father lost work and his family used SNAP for a few months to stay afloat. To him, assistance wasn't a crutch. It was a lifeline that helped them get through a crisis. Whenever he heard talk about dependency, he felt like people didn't understand how unpredictable life could be. Across the room, Representative Jasmine Crockett sat waiting. She didn't interrupt. She didn't shift in her seat. She simply held her pen, tapping it lightly against her notepad. It wasn't impatience, more like she was listening to every line, preparing her turn to speak. What stood out most was the stillness in her expression. She looked like someone who knew how quickly a conversation about numbers could become a conversation about real people. And she was ready for it. The room was full of small sounds papers being turned. Someone's cough, the soft hum of camera's butt. Underneath all of that, a quiet sense of anticipation started to build. A few people in the back leaned forward slightly, as if they already knew the discussion was heading toward a point of tension. J.D. Vance continued outlining his reasoning, mentioning rising national debt and long-term solutions. He spoke about how programs should lift people up, not keep them stuck. He argued that cutting unnecessary spending now could create a stronger system later. But as he talked, Jasmine's expression remained calm, almost too calm, and Maya noticed. She nudged Evan and whispered, "She's waiting for something." Evan nodded without taking his eyes off Jasmine. He had seen clips of her before. She usually spoke with precision, and when she asked a question, it often hit directly at the heart of the issue. When J.D. Vance finished his explanation, there was a brief pause. It lasted only a couple of seconds, but felt longer, like the room was holding its breath. This was the moment that made every student lean closer. They weren't here for drama. They were here because they wanted to see how real discussions worked. They wanted to witness what happened when two very different points of view met face to face. Jasmine finally lifted her head and looked toward the chair. She didn't raise her voice. She simply said she had a few questions. Her tone was calm, almost gentle, but it pulled the room in. Even the students who had drifted off earlier were suddenly alert. Maya felt the energy shift. She didn't know what Jasmine would say yet, but she sensed this was the moment people would talk about later. She whispered, "Here it comes," and even Evan couldn't deny the suspense building around them. What made the moment powerful wasn't anger or confrontation, it was the contrast. J.D. Vance had just spent several minutes laying out a polished, structured explanation. Now, Jasmine was stepping in with a silence that felt sharper than words. She hadn't spoken yet, but everyone could feel her preparing to aim at something more personal, more grounded. Something that had little to do with budget charts and everything to do with human experience. The hook wasn't in what had been said. It was in what was about to be said. The students didn't know whose argument would feel stronger. They didn't know whether Jasmine would shift the entire room or whether J.D. Vance's steady logic would hold firm. But they did know this. The debate was no longer just about numbers. It was about people like Evan's family, people Maya had interviewed for school projects. People across the country trying to survive while prices kept rising faster than wages. And as Jasmine finally opened her notebook, preparing her first question, the entire room leaned forward. Not because they expected a fight, but because they sensed they were about to witness the difference between discussing policy and understanding the people who lived inside that policy every day. Jasmine Crockett didn't raise her voice when she began speaking, but something about her tone immediately changed the room. It was steady, calm, and direct, the kind of tone that made people stop whatever they were doing and listen. She wasn't reacting emotionally. She wasn't trying to match J.D. Vance's polished explanation. She was aiming for something deeper. Her first question came fast. Almost too fast for the staffers scrambling to follow along. "Senator Vance," she said, "you talk about helping people become independent. But before we talk about independence, can you tell me how long the average SNAP benefit lasts in a household facing rising food prices?" The question seemed simple, but the room caught the shift instantly. She wasn't debating theory, she was testing knowledge. She was testing experience. J.D. Vance paused, and it wasn't a long pause. Just long enough for people to notice he didn't have the number ready. He gave a general answer, something about monthly cycles, something about budgeting. It wasn't wrong, but it wasn't specific, and that was all Jasmine needed. She leaned forward slightly. "The average benefit runs out after about 20 days, she said. "That's assuming no unexpected bills, no medical emergencies, and no school lunches added on. 20 days, Senator. That means families spend the last 10 days of every month filling the gap themselves." The students in the room looked at each other, surprised. They'd never heard it explained like that, simple, clear, and without blame. J.D. Vance tried to respond. He talked about the need for economic responsibility, about the importance of long-term reforms, about encouraging work. His voice stayed steady, but Jasmine didn't rush. She let him finish every sentence, every explanation, every attempt to redirect the conversation. Then she asked her second question. "Do you know," she said softly, "how many people on SNAP are working already?" This time, the pause was even shorter, but still noticeable. J.D. Vance began talking about job requirements and employment. Incentives, but again, it sounded like a general statement, not a lived reality. Jasmine nodded slowly, her expression unchanged. "Most SNAP recipients who can work, do work," she said. "They're not choosing assistance instead of a job. They're choosing assistance because wages aren't keeping up with the cost of living." That's the part missing from this conversation. A few heads in the room turned toward Evan. His face said everything he had lived, that truth. And now it had been spoken out loud in a room where decisions were made. But Jasmine wasn't done. She flipped a page in her notebook, not dramatically, just with a calm confidence that signaled she was moving to something heavier. "Senator," she continued, "you said the program traps people. Can I ask you something else? Talk to a family who lost SNAP benefits while still struggling with rent, childcare, or medical bills." There was no accusation in her voice. It wasn't hostile, was sincere, almost gentle, but the weight of the question was clear. She wasn't debating policy anymore. She was pointing to the human gap that existed in policymaking, a gap between numbers and lived experience. J.D. Vance spoke about data, about studies, about economic models. He didn't claim to speak for people he hadn't met. He spoke from a distance, from strategy, from analysis. And yet that distance was exactly what Jasmine was trying to expose, not to embarrass him, but to show how different perspectives lead to different conclusions. Maya watched, fascinated. She wasn't rooting for Jasmine or J.D. Vance. She was watching the contrast between them, and the contrast made her think. One side focused on structure. The other focused on people living inside that structure. Jasmine continued, when we cut benefits, we're not cutting laziness. We're cutting food, medicine, electricity, and stability. These cuts don't motivate people. They push them into crisis. Her voice didn't rise, but it became firmer. Senator, you talk about long-term solutions, she said. But hunger doesn't wait for long-term solutions. Rent doesn't wait. A child's empty lunchbox doesn't wait. The room felt tighter, like the air had shifted from policy talk to something painfully real. Even staffers started taking notes more seriously. Everyone felt the weight of the conversation, not because it was dramatic, but because it was painfully familiar to millions of people across the country. J.D. Vance tried to reframe the discussion. He talked about the need to improve job opportunities. It's the importance of reducing government spending, the dangers of endless dependency. His argument wasn't careless. He truly believed he was protecting the system from collapse. But Jasmine had a point of her own. You're not wrong about wanting stability, she said. You're not wrong about wanting people to grow. But growth requires a foundation. You can't tell someone to climb a ladder when they're still trying to keep their feet on the ground. Evan felt those words hit him directly. He remembered the nights when his family stretched every dollar. He remembered his father bringing home discount groceries, trying to make them last. He remembered feeling embarrassed, even though he shouldn't have. He remembered how 1 month of help gave them enough breathing room to get back on track. Maya saw the debate differently. She admired both sides, one focused on structure and long-term planning, the other focused on real-world impact. She realized that the best solutions probably lived somewhere between the two viewpoints, even if neither side wanted to admit it out loud. And as Jasmine finished her last point, she closed her notebook slowly, not as a victory gesture, but as a reminder that the conversation wasn't over. The room didn't erupt. There was no shouting, no anger, just a quiet realization spreading across the students and staff. This wasn't a battle. It was a collision of two truths, one statistical, one human meeting in the same room for the first time. The room felt different now. The earlier formality had faded, replaced by a quiet heaviness that made even the rustle of papers sound loud. J.D. Vance adjusted his notes as if trying to regain the rhythm he had started with. He was not rattled, but he could feel the shift. Jasmine Crockett hadn't attacked him. She had simply brought human experience into a conversation built on budgets. And that changed everything. J.D. Vance leaned forward and spoke in a calm, measured tone. Representative Crockett, I respect your point, he said. But we can't ignore the fact that programs grow, costs rise, and without reform, we risk creating a system that can't survive another generation. He spoke about sustainability, about the duty leaders had to think beyond the next 5 years. He explained that difficult choices were part of governing, and that temporary discomfort sometimes created long-term strength. His argument wasn't heartless, it was structured, like the way engineers talk about buildings or doctors talk about treatment plans. To him, the biggest danger wasn't short-term pain. It was long-term collapse. The room listened quietly. Even Jasmine gave him her full attention. Then she said, I understand the fear of collapse. But do you know what collapses first? Families without support. And they collapse long before the system does. Her words landed softly but clearly. To everyone's surprise, J.D. Vance didn't argue. Instead, he paused and said something few expected. Representative, I grew up with tough circumstances. I know what it looks like up close, he said. I don't want to remove help. I want to make sure the help reaches the right places. His voice didn't waver. For a moment, the room felt like it had stepped out of the political arena and into a real conversation between two people who genuinely cares, just in very different ways. And then, something unexpected happened. One of the students, Evan, shifted in his seat, and Jasmine noticed. She made eye contact, not deliberately, but enough that he looked away, suddenly self-conscious. Maya nudged him. "You okay?" she whispered. Evan nodded, though his mind was racing. Hearing them debate felt like someone was peeling back layers of a memory he tried not to think about too often. Vance continued. People need a push sometimes. When support systems get too comfortable, they can unintentionally trap people. Before he could finish, Jasmine spoke, not cutting him off sharply, but stepping into the space between his words. "Sometimes people don't need a push," she said. "They need someone to stop them from falling." The room went silent again, but instead of returning to statistics or policy, Jasmine did something she rarely did in hearings. She shared a personal moment. "There was a woman in my district," she said. "She worked 2 jobs. She still needed SNAP for 3 months while her son recovered from surgery. She wasn't lazy. She wasn't looking for shortcuts. She was just trying to make sure her child healed without losing her home." Her voice remained steady, but the story carried its own weight. "She told me something I will never forget," Jasmine continued. She said, "I didn't need help forever. I just needed help right then." The students in the room nodded. They had seen people like that in their neighborhoods, their schools, their own families. Suddenly, policy didn't seem abstract. It felt familiar. Vance listened respectfully. Then he said something that surprised even Maya. "I don't doubt her story," he said. "And I don't doubt your compassion. But we also need accountability. Some people need help. Others take advantage of the system. That's the part we struggle to talk about." For the first time, the tension in the room didn't feel like conflict. It felt like honesty. They were no longer opponents defending arguments. They were two people confronting the messy truth that both viewpoints contain flaws. Jasmine nodded slowly. "There will always be some people who exploit programs," she said. "But we shouldn't design policy around the few who cheat. We should design policy around the many who try." She leaned back in her chair. "The woman I told you about. She's back at work. She's paying taxes. She's contributing to her community. That's the majority of people on assistance. They get back up." The room felt warmer now, as if the heavy tension had softened into thoughtfulness. Then Maya did something she wasn't supposed to do during a hearing. She quietly whispered, "Why does this feel like the first real conversation I've heard today?" Evan nodded, still processing everything. He understood both sides. He had lived through hardship, but he also knew programs sometimes failed or got misused. The debate wasn't about choosing a hero or villain. It was about balancing two truths: responsibility and compassion. Vance straightened in his chair, sensing the shift. "Representative Crockett," he said, "I want people to succeed. All of them. My concern is that if the system keeps expanding without limits, there will come a day when it collapses and no one gets help." "And my concern," Jasmine replied, "is that if we keep cutting support, we push families into deeper problems that cost even more to fix later." For the first time, the students couldn't tell who was winning, because maybe this wasn't a win-or-lose conversation. Maybe it was the kind of debate where the truth lived somewhere in the middle, waiting for leaders willing to meet there. The chair called for a brief recess, and the room slowly relaxed. Staffers stood. Cameras powered down. People stretched their legs, but the students stayed seated. They had come to watch a political argument. Instead, they witnessed something far more rare: two leaders, standing on opposite sides of an issue, finally seeing the part of the world the other was trying to. protect, and that feeling unexpected and honest lingered in the air long after the microphones went quiet. The studio lights dimmed as the show moved into its final segment, and a quiet calm settled over the room. The debate between J.D. Vance and Jasmine Crockett had stirred emotions. But now came the moment everyone was waiting for. The moment when real people, ones most affected by the issue, would speak. The audience leaned forward as the moderator invited callers and studio guests to share their thoughts. This shift created a softer, more human tone, and it helped remind everyone that beyond political talking points, real families lived with the outcomes of these decisions every day. The first voice came from a young father named Marcus. He worked full-time as a warehouse supervisor, and he explained how the rising cost of living had pushed his family close to the edge. He told the panel that he didn't like depending on assistance programs. But when rent, diapers, and grocery bills climbed at the same time, SNAP helped him bridge the gap. Marcus did not sound angry, only tired and honest. He admitted he wanted to be fully self-sufficient. But he said programs like SNAP kept his kids from going to bed hungry during the toughest months. His story hung in the air, forcing everyone to rethink the assumptions they brought into the conversation. Then came a woman named Helen, a retired schoolteacher with a steady pension. She spoke gently, saying she respected programs that helped the vulnerable, but she believed the system needed more accountability. She shared that she had seen abuse during her teaching years. Students who came from homes where adults struggled with addiction or poor financial planning. She said those families needed more than just money. They needed guidance, education, and community support. She wasn't against SNAP, but she felt the program should teach people how to climb out of hardship, not simply help them survive inside it. Her perspective did not dismiss Marcus's story. It added another layer. It reminded everyone that poverty was complex and sometimes required deeper solutions. As the callers continued, the mood of the studio shifted again. What started as a political segment now felt like a town hall meeting where everyone was searching for understanding. The messages coming in showed how mixed the country felt. Some people believed SNAP needed reform to stay sustainable. Others believed cuts would harm families already trying their best. And somewhere in the middle were people who weren't sure. They only wanted fairness, balance, and a system that lifted people up. J.D. Vance listened closely. He stood by his belief that programs worked best when limited and structured, but hearing people directly softened his tone. He spoke with more care, saying he understood the stress families felt right now. The economy had changed faster than most people could adjust, and he acknowledged that even hardworking Americans sometimes needed help. He admitted the real challenge was finding a system that encouraged progress without punishing those caught in difficult situations. His shift didn't change his core view, but it made him sound less like a politician defending a position and more like someone searching for solutions. Alongside everyone else, Jasmine Crockett followed, speaking with a calm voice that contrasted with her earlier intensity. She said she appreciated hearing from people like Marcus and Helen because it reminded her why she fought so hard in the first place. She believed programs like SNAP were investments in human dignity, but she agreed they should include more resources, job training, budgeting support, and mental health services. She said the country would be stronger if it invested not only in safety nets, but also in long-term growth for families. She wasn't backing down from her concerns about the cuts, but she acknowledged that every system, even the most necessary ones, could evolve. The moderator closed the show by asking one final question. What is the real goal? To reduce spending, or to build a society where fewer people need help in the first place? That question created a hush across the studio. It was the kind of question that made people think long after the cameras stopped rolling. No one had a perfect answer. Maybe no one ever truly would. But the important thing was that both sides were at least trying to walk toward the same point. even if they approached it from different directions. When the cameras finally shut off, JD and Jasmine exchanged a calm, professional nod. They didn't agree on everything, maybe not even most things, but there was respect in that moment. They understood they were both trying to solve a problem that had no easy answer. The country they were speaking to was full of people like Marcus and Helen, people who lived real lives, made real sacrifices, and needed real solutions. Meanwhile, Lena, Chris, and the rest of the college group walked out of the studio with their own thoughts racing. Chris admitted he understood Jasmine's points more clearly than before. Lena admitted she understood why people like JD worried about sustainability. And the others found themselves somewhere in the middle, realizing that issues were rarely as simple as political slogans made them seem. Outside the studio, the night air felt cool and refreshing. People were still talking, still debating, still sharing ideas. But the energy was different now, less combative, more thoughtful. What started as a clash of arguments had ended as a collective moment of reflection. And that was the quiet victory of the night, not that one side won, but that the conversation opened hearts a little wider and sharpened minds a little more. The debate didn't solve everything, but it planted something more important: the desire to keep learning, keep listening, and keep searching for common ground in a country that needed it more than ever.